Alright, so now that I've cleaned this entire Glock 43, I'm going to go ahead and start putting it back together. And I'm basically going to do it in reverse order from how I took it apart. So I'm going to start with the frame. One thing I recommend doing if you're going to be doing a full disassembly like this, keep the slide parts with the slide parts and keep the frame parts with the frame parts. It's going to be hard to mix up different parts, but still it's just good to kind of compartmentalize everything and make sure you keep it as simple for yourself as possible. So what I'm going to start with is the magazine release. Now, in the disassembly video, I didn't pull out that little pin, but it's going to make it a lot easier if I do that for the assembly. So what I'm going to do is basically use the pliers on here and get that little pin out again. Hopefully you guys can see it down here. I'm going to use a little pick here just so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. Kind of underneath that little guy, this little bar right here. I'm just going to pull that out with my pliers. Alright, so now that that's out, just like that, I'm just going to slide the magazine release into place. Just put it through the channel just like that, so it should have the textured part on the left side if you're a righty, and then the flat part will be on the right side of the frame. So now with that out, I'm just going to pop that bar back in place. Just slide it right down into the middle of that V and then push it into place. Alright, so now with that in place, I'm just going to take my angled pick here and then just push it off to the right into that groove on the magazine release. And once you hear it pop into place, now your magazine release is going to work just fine. If you want to function test it, you can just pop it in there and then make sure that it will actually retain your magazine, and then make sure that it will release your magazine. Just as a note, in case Rage Quit's watching, I do have two of these. So one has the steel case ammo still, and then one has carry ammo as a backup mag for the Tango Down +2 base plates carrying Hornady Critical Duty Light, which is designed for smaller frame handguns. Anyway, just as a side note. So now with the magazine release back together, I'm going to put the trigger housing or trigger assembly back together. This is going to get a little bit fiddly, but you know, it is what it is. So, alright, so with those grooves up here, I'm just going to push in through the top part and then slide that bar into the lower section and push it in. So that should be in the bottom part, but you can't push it in through the bottom part. You have to get the top in first and then slide it in the base and get it up through there. At that point, you have the bar in here. Now this is going to be where it's going to get complicated. I'm going to zoom in just to make this a little bit easier, and you can kind of see more of what I'm doing. But I have to get this spring now. Now this is not the smallest spring, but again, if you keep the frame parts with the frame parts, it's going to be the smallest of the frame springs, but it is not smaller than the plunger spring. I'm going to use my finger on this right side to kind of push down on it to get it to pop up like that. And I'm just going to slide in the spring over the top of it. Now, if you don't have your finger if you don't have your finger covering this part, when you push the spring on, it's just going to push that arm back out. So once you get it started past the base of that spring, it's going to be a little bit easier to push on. Now at this point, with my left middle finger, I'm going to hold the front part in place, and I'm going to take this little retainer arm and slide it on. So when I slide it on, I want the hook part to be facing towards the right side of the trigger housing, and I'm just going to slide it on over the bar. Now again, this is not always the most fun thing to do, but once I get it past the little bar on the tip here, I'm going to try to rotate it just so it locks in place. But you got to kind of multitask here and push down with this while pushing the spring down and getting it around that arm, which is sometimes easier said than done. There's probably an easier way to do this, but I am not familiar with it, if there is. All right, there we go. So now that I got that in place, you can see I just have it barely offset there, and all I got to do is push it straight up like that. That took me probably far longer than I'll show in the video because it's really fiddly and I'm trying to not completely cover it. But that's what we want it to look like. That little lip facing up just like that, and with that, those two lines perpendicular to each other, locking it in place. So at that point, let me zoom out a little bit. We're going to take the connector and push this connector through from the right hand side, just like this. And again, that gap is normal. You want that gap there. It's supposed to be like that. Don't try to straighten it out. At this point, we got to lock the front part of this cruciform shape right here, lock it into there, and then lock this right hand part, well, it's going to be on the firearm's left hand side ultimately, into that little slot back here. So I'm going to push down and then kind of rock it into place just like that. And it should kind of just hold itself in there. So at this point, our trigger assembly is put back together, and we can just drop it straight into our frame. I like to start with that housing back there, make sure that trigger part's aligned, and then just push it straight down in. Sometimes that trigger bar will get caught up, and you just kind of have to force it in there just like that. All right, so now with our trigger assembly back in, we can put this pin back through the back part of the frame, and then I will just take my little screwdriver end and make that nice and flush. All right, just like that. Okay, so now I'm going to take my slide lock and drop it in here from the top. Now, normally on full-size Glocks, you can just push it in from the back and push it forward, but because of the spring here on the front end, you kind of have to already have it as forward as it needs to be, and then just drop it straight down. And you want to look to make sure that you can see light going all the way through. So with that in place, I'm going to drop the locking block back in. We want these arms facing forward, and it'll just slide right down into that channel. So at that point, we can just take this locking bar, and then again, you can see people hammering it in. You don't need to do that. Just kind of fiddle around with the slide lock. You can even kind of see it opening and closing that gap. You just kind of fiddle around until it wants to move through on its own. So you don't have to hammer it, completely unnecessary. And at this point, our frame is totally back together, so now we'll just work on the slide. So for the slide, what I'm going to do first is reassemble our striker. So here we have our striker, and we have this black sleeve that goes over it. I'm just going to slide this sleeve over, open part facing aft, just slide it in and get it all the way in there just like that. So I'm going to use the back part of the slide again to get this spring back on. What I'm going to have to do is slide the spring on, and while holding it down, I'm going to have to get these cups back in place. And this can be a real pain, and we have to be very, very careful, because if anything slides apart or if this whole thing topples over, it can send these cups flying, and you're going to have to buy them or just spend hours and hours searching for them. Or if you're lucky, they'll land right next to where you're working. So we'll see if I get lucky, but I'm going to try to get a better angle for you guys, or at least zoom in so you guys can see what I'm doing. It's not going to be easy doing this behind the camera. So I'm going to slide this on, push straight down, put in one of these cups on one side, and when you put the cups on, you want the thinner part facing down, and it's going to lock between the spring and the top part of that striker. If you're careful, you can kind of fiddle it around to make it easier to get your second one in place. Just going to slide that around to make this second one a little bit easier. Holding the spring down is like holding traction on someone with a broken bone. Once you start, you really shouldn't stop until everything's braced and ready to go. Alright, so now that I got both of them locked in place, I'm going to very gently release pressure just to make sure everything goes back to where it's supposed to, and now we have that striker back together. Alright, so going back in the reverse process, I'm going to put this safety plunger back in place. This is going to be the smallest spring in the entire firearm, so it's going to go back in place right there. It's going to be the only one that fits in there anyway. But now we are going to pop it back into place here. So the nice thing about the plunger on the 43 is it'll only go in one way. You can't put it in wrong. But this open channel, the bigger channel, is going to be facing, or the deeper channel I should say, is going to be facing outboard. But again, you can't put it in wrong. It's shaped so that you won't be able to put it in wrong. Once you have that in there, I'm going to put in my extractor. To get it in, I'm just going to push up on this plunger, which you can see opens up this area for the extractor. So if you look in there, you can see there's a little circle back in there. That's going to correspond with the little circle on our extractor. Just put it in just like that, and it should go in nice and easy. At that point, I can release pressure on that plunger, and the extractor will stay in place. Now, we have our extractor in, but it's not going to do anything unless we have the spring in place. Again, when you put the spring in here, you have a solid part and you have a spring-looking part. The solid part is going to go forward. So the spring part, you should see the black tip here at the very back. I'm going to slide our striker assembly back into the slide. Now at this point, you're going to have to push down on the striker. Sometimes, maybe if you have long nails, you can just do that by hand. I typically will have a harder time, so what I'll usually do is take a screwdriver and push down on this little black sleeve while pushing the back plate into place. So I'm going to get that staged ready to go and just push down until I can slide it in. Now again, we have the extractor spring in the way, so I'll just push down on that until I can push the back plate past that. Once it's past that, all you got to do is push it until it clicks. You want to make sure it clicks in, and it should be nice and flush all the way around. Now we can just push in our barrel. Now I like to pinch it just like this. Put the tip in first, and then rock it back into place. Again, everything should be nice and flush there at the back. You're going to take our recoil spring. You want the black end forward, the thicker end forward. Lock it right into the lip there, and then you'll have to push in on it and get it to sit in there just like that. Now if you don't get it in there like that, your slide will not go back on your frame properly, but again, it's hard to mess up. So at this point I just need to get the rails on the frame to match in with these ends on the slide. Slide it in just like that. Do a quick function check. Alright, so and then just for the function check, just if you guys are curious, I'll rack the slide to reset the trigger, pull the trigger, holding the trigger to the rear, I'll cycle the slide, release pressure, hear it click, pull it, do that a couple times, just make sure everything is nice and together, and there you have it. We have this Glock 43 back together, ready to get put back into service as a carry weapon or whatever you're going to use it as. So as you can see, the assembly is going to be a little bit more complicated than the disassembly. That's usually how everything works anyway. It's easier to take things apart than put them back together. But it's not too complicated. There's really not too many parts involved in these. So it's fairly simple. Hopefully I was able to explain it in a way that was easy to follow. If you have any questions, feel free to throw those in the comment section below. If you want to see a full review on the 43, I've done a comparison with the Shield. But if you want to see a standalone review of the Glock 43, let me know. But again, as always, I hope you're able to get something out of this video, and I really appreciate you watching. Let me use this to point right in there. That's what's keeping that in place. So kind of similar to the other ones, you just want to kind of pull it up and pivot it out kind of pivot the rear end outboard, and it'll come out for you. At that point, your trigger is fully disassembled. Oh man. Of course, everything's nice and slick with oil. Let's put this back in place. Oh, man. I love working behind a camera. All right. Get that. Son of a bitch. All right. Try this one more time. All right.